Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the ALNAP Urban Webinar Series. Today we are going to be talking about market analysis and how that can support effective urban humanitarian response. Thank you so much to all of you who've joined us so far and everyone just joining now. Thank you as well to our three speakers who I'll be introducing you to in just a moment. We're really excited to be able to share with you some experiences of doing market analysis and understanding in urban response, and we've got two very excellent presentations today. So I'm going to jump right into those in just a minute. I'd like to start today off with asking for you, the audience, to give us a bit of information to help us as we go through the webinar. I'm going to be launching a poll momentarily, which will allow you to let us know the degree of understanding you have of urban market analysis already. And while the poll is going on, I'll be introducing you to our speakers. The first speaker we have is joining us from Oxfam. His name is Alexandre, and he began his career with WFP and ACF in both Haiti and West Africa, having previous experience in international relations. Recently, he joined Oxfam as the Global Emergency Food Security and Livelihoods Advisor, where he is also the lead for markets. Previously, he was based in the East Africa Regional Office, and he has a background in monitoring, implementation, and assessing cash and market programming. And his experience with both the EMA and PC MMA tools has been both with rural and urban contexts in a variety of responses around the world. Our second presentation has two speakers. The first is Laura Phelps, who is the Urban Displacement Advisor for NRC, the Norwegian Refugee Council. Laura has over 16 years experience in humanitarian response, including both in operations and headquarters roles. Her background is in food security and livelihoods, where she's supported and led cash and markets-based responses, as well as the development of tools. Her urban work has focused on assessment and targeting in urban contexts, with the development of an app for multi-sectoral assessments to be released next year. She's a member of the Urban Expert Group of the World Humanitarian Summit, as well as the advisory group for Sphere in urban contexts. Our final speaker is Emmeline. She's an independent humanitarian consultant with experience in the humanitarian sector for over 10 years. She's managed food security and livelihoods programs in conflict and natural disaster contexts. She's been leading over the past 5 years several emergency and pre-crisis market mapping analysis, including in conflict-affected countries in Africa, including Chad, CAR, and DRC, as well as the Middle East in Gaza, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. Her work also includes an exploration of livelihood-related market systems, including income generation, labor, credit, the social sector, and food. So as I mentioned, a huge wealth of experience, and we're very happy that they were all able to join us here today. About 80% of you have now voted, so I'll read out the results of the poll. We have quite a diverse audience today, which is great. About 40% of you are new to market analysis. 20% have some market analysis experience but non-urban. About 10% know quite a lot about market analysis but not in urban contexts. And another 30% of you have some experience or understanding of urban markets. Thank you again, and I give you Alexandre.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my presentation for today, I'll try to focus on recent work that Oxfam carried out in different contexts. So the focus will be on some case studies. And just on my first page, maybe this picture will be familiar to some of you. This is the iron market in Port-au-Prince after the earthquake. So rapidly, I'll be talking about the market analysis in urban setting, challenges in market analysis, and then a brief history from EMA to PCMMA with a focus on urban context, and I'll end with the way forward in terms of market analysis. So urban spaces as networks. So I think it's useful to consider urban spaces as a series of networks. Not not just physical, but also political, social, and economic. They are sometimes visible, so physical networks such as roads, and sometimes invisible, political, social networks that connect people. And urban markets are actually both visible, but also invisible in terms of source for livelihood, for example, for income generation. Networks can increase or decrease the capabilities of affected communities. For example, when a damaged mobile phone tower is being restored, this opens up new opportunities and new capabilities. A network's value grows as more people connect to it. If a local market, for example, reopens quickly, its customers will be able to reestablish their own livelihoods. So there is here an interesting multiplier effect of restoring urban markets. And this will be pretty much guiding my presentation, this multiplying effect and the potential benefits that we can get from restoring actually affected parts of the urban market systems. So assessments must support humanitarian organizations to understand how these networks can help or hinder relief efforts. Markets are, of course, a type of assessment, but also the other assessments. So this is because of the specific characteristic of the urban environment and urban markets. A purely geographic approach to assessing urban areas is not the best approach. There's a need for a systemic approach, and this is pretty much why the market mapping analysis has been used quite extensively by Oxfam throughout the years to understand some of the interplay between the different actors. So the importance of market system. So markets are important because they ensure survival. They provide essential items or services to meet basic needs, but they also protect livelihoods. For example, they help to provide tools, agriculture inputs and services in rural areas, or replacing other livelihood assets. They also provide jobs and opportunities for wage labor or linking to buyers for the produce. So markets are essential for providing people access to basic goods and services, but also for people's livelihoods and for economic development. So disrupting markets, for example, with large-scale in-kind distribution or ignoring markets during or after an emergency will potentially weaken people's access to basic goods, services, and income-generating opportunities, and can destroy or delay the ability of people to return to their livelihoods. So my key message is that, okay, it's important to undertake market analysis, but it should go beyond usual responses. So often market analysis or market assessment have been used just to see if cash transfer programming are feasible or not. Do traders have the capacity to expand? Yes or no? Okay, good. We've done the market analysis. Part of this analysis was a market assessment. We collected the data. We have the evidence that we can actually do a cash transfer. The donor will be happy. Okay, there is much more that can be done. Okay, and this is pretty much what Oxfam is promoting. So we developed recently the market-based programming spectrum. So this is an interesting diagram, and this framework is actually under revision. But this showed the evolution and the different type of market interventions that can take place, from markets indifferent to market integrated relief. So this is pretty much when I said usual responses, I was referring to this. So the cash transfer, for example, so it's market aware and it's market integrated relief. But it's also possible to do indirect support through markets by supporting some critical players, actors, or services in a market system. And the more ambitious potential intervention is market strengthening and development for economic recovery, improvement in incomes and livelihoods, for example. So briefly, I'd like to talk about the development of the EMA toolkit that took place from 2007 to 2010. So a need for better analysis of markets in emergency was identified. So IRC, Oxfam and Practical Action developed the Emergency Market Mapping Analysis Toolkit, so EMA. So as some of you know, EMA uses gap analysis, market analysis, and response analysis to examine the extent to which critical market systems are functioning and can be used and supported to meet people's needs. So I'll be talking a bit about you'll be hearing critical market systems. So these are the very important systems. So those that play a critical role or crucial role in people's survival. So obviously you have your staple food, but you also have key elements for hygiene, for example, like soap or CGI, corrugated galvanized iron sheets, for example. These are often used as critical market system. So EMAs rely on good enough data and what we also call optimal ignorance or appropriate imprecision. This is not meant to be a very statistically representative survey. The whole idea of the EMA is to go out there in the field, collect some data, and rapidly get a good understanding of how a market system operates. So an EMA pilot assessment was carried out in Haiti after the tropical storm in 2008, and the results were quite encouraging. So when the earthquake happened in Haiti in 2010, the idea was also to carry out a multi-agency EMA. So this is the first case study, the Port-au-Prince earthquake in 2010. The Gudu, as it was called in Haiti, for those who were there. So the EMA team was led by RSC and included a total of 18 staff members from 11 organizations. So this is a very interesting point about this EMA. It's this multi-agency dimension of this exercise. So while supporting those people, such as market traders, who traditionally are not perceived to be amongst the most vulnerable, it may appear to be contrary to many NGO mandates. Recognizing the role they play is a central tenet of EMA. So market traders do not seem as vulnerable, but they actually often play a critical role in market systems. So by carrying out an EMA, we identify this critical role and see how more vulnerable people's foot on these intermediaries. So the EMA team looked at the following market systems. So emergency basic needs, so beans and rice, staple food in Haiti, income potential, construction labor, and longer term livelihood. So this is when they focus on corrugated iron sheeting. So after the earthquake, small retailers lost their working capital, they stock, and at times their shops. And it was actually the small wholesalers level that was most badly affected. 80% of these small wholesalers had facilities and were unable to re-engage with the market due to insufficient capital or access to credit. So you remember the first picture that I showed on my title slide. So it was the earthquake, and this is the iron market. I think pretty much a year after the earthquake, first large-scale infrastructure that was rehabilitated, rebuilt after the earthquake, thanks to the own funding of the funder of Digicel, so the biggest mobile network provider in Haiti. And this is a good example of how critical a physical market, the critical role that a physical market play. Inside the market, there are more than 900 vendors. So this is a picture from the inside, and outside there are also a lot of vendors. So this is in downtown Port-au-Prince. So this was rehabilitated. It helped to get back on their feet. So it had a very positive impact on people's food security. So this is not an example of Oxfam's work, but just to show the type of market support intervention that can take place and that can have a very positive impact on vulnerable people's lives. Briefly, this is an example of the market system for corrugated sheet that was carried out in 2010. So I'm not going to go into the details, but just to show that this is what happens if humanitarian agencies decide to distribute in-kind CGI sheets. So it will be pretty much bypassing those retailers and the sellers in Haiti and absorbing all the, and we see the different impact and the change with the red arrows. And some of you might know, obviously after the earthquake, storage was a big concern. So a lot of hosts had lost their storage capacity, and NGOs who were planning in-kind were renting, were taking most of the storage. First case, this first example, the EMA led by NRC and Oxfam after focusing on, so that was in the response phase. The second case study is Nairobi, Mukuru slums. And this is pretty much what paved the way for pre-crisis market mapping and analysis. So market analysis has been in practice primarily confined to rely on qualitative and quantitative good enough data to understand the market system at reference and cover. And EMA is conducting during or right after a crisis. This is what I in Haiti. The PCMA is conducted in a crisis-prone area, but when the situation is normal, so what we call pre-crisis. So a good understanding of key markets can mitigate the potential intervention on livelihoods. For example, in-kind distribution will impact local traders. And also, it will identify opportunities for livelihood rehabilitation and market-based programming. Again, it was an initiative led by IRC and Oxfam. It was part of what we call analysis. And it was pretty much based on the shortcoming 2011 drought in Horn of Africa response and of planning, of implementing timely response. The PCMA was one of the elements developed through this initiative. So the market assessment that was carried in Mukuru, which is a slum area in Nairobi, focused on different services and one credit market systems. So, and it showed how the credit market system functions in normal settings and how it was functioning during the 2011 drought, and how the whole economy was actually affected, and how difficult it was for the very poor to get access to credit from the other wealth group, those who are in a tiny bit better, the poor ones. So in a crisis situation, the poor can no longer afford to lend money to the very poor. So there were in effect rapidly the key findings of this pre-crisis market mapping analysis exercise in Mukuru slum, was that the emergency is now. So across different critical market teams, so one of them was the credit market system, the same message was echoed. The emergency is now. Even in non-emergency contexts in Mukuru, people are living far below the sphere standards. Is it sufficient to wait until there's a crisis to design responses to address both chronic and emergency needs? And designing responses that seek to support survival and protect livelihood needs now will strengthen the resilience of the targeted group when there's a crisis. So the idea was to better understand how the system currently functions, referring to a previous crisis, and anticipate how critical market system, in this case the credit market system, would behave if such a situation happens. My last example or case study is the market assessment that was recently carried out by Oxfam in Kathmandu after the earthquake, and it focuses on women in the labor market. So my first case study showed the use of Emma directly a shock, so the earthquake. The second case study in Mukuru slums showed how to better understand markets in a normal setting. So, and this third one is about market assessment after a crisis, but not in the initial phase. So this was done in August, so pretty much 6 months. The Emma, which has been designed in the early phase of the crisis, 3 to 4 weeks, is not exactly ideal in such a setting 6 months later. So the idea that I'd like to put forward here is that the Emma tool was used, but it was a modified Emma tool. So we wanted to understand livelihood opportunities for marginalized groups, in this case, women. So, and Emma has some shortcomings, so you can get some very useful information with Emma, but you can't get, there are some limitations. So in this case, the Oxfam team with some partners use the Emma with another tool, which is an element of what we call the Gender Enterprise and Market Toolkit, which is a tool developed by our colleagues from the development department. And in order to inform recovery programming, they used one of these components, which is the rapid care analysis, to understand the role of women, their availability in terms of time, and all the amount of time that they were spending during the day on unpaid care work. And this will be the last part of my presentation. This is the way forward. So a key message on market mapping analysis, whether it's an Emma or a PCMA, is getting a good team together. When I was presenting the PCMA approach in Southern Africa, when I was based there, the comments that I received from some of the government members is that, well, Emma, we know it, but this is an NGO or UN agency tool. You know, you go there, you do this market assessment, you don't involve local partners. And I think this is one of the very interesting advantage of the PCMA is it's not a crisis, it's not during a crisis, so there is more time to actually put together a good team and involving local stakeholders, local municipalities, and local partners with a good mix of analytical skills and contextual knowledge. What Oxfam is promoting at the moment is obviously market analysis after a shock, but also before a shock in a crisis-prone context, so PCMMA, and also after the shock, maybe 5 months or 6 months to inform recovery interventions. Market mapping analysis has been predominantly used in the food security sector. More and more other sectors are interested, and the latest PCMMA that we conducted was in Harare earlier this year, and in Juba a couple of weeks ago. And the focus was on preparedness in the wash sector. The importance of working with the private sector, realizing the role that they play, and identifying how they can actually contribute to the work that we do. And the last part will be on multi-sector market assessment. Oxfam, part of the UNHCR Enhanced Response Capacity, developed an approach to carry out multi-sector market assessment to inform cross-sectoral cash transfer or multi-purpose cash grants. So this is also the thing that we're promoting now. We'll be rolling this out in 2016. How to understand the different needs of people who've been affected, whether they are IDPs, refugees. How can we better get together from different sectors, different agencies, understanding these needs using, for example, the minimum expenditure basket. And then once these needs have been identified, how can we carry out a multi-sector market assessment to understand the different players in these critical market systems. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Alexandre. That was very interesting and a lot of things there. I give to you now, Laura and Emily.
Thanks for the invite to join today, everybody. And as Leah said, my name's Laura Phelps. I'm the Urban Displacement Advisor for NRC, and I'm joined by Emmeline Saint, who's an independent consultant, and who's done some of the markets assessments that we're going to be sharing with you today. So, as some of you will know, NRC works with people who are displaced, and as more than half of the world's IDPs and refugees live in urban areas, that's the reason we have such a big focus on urban displacement. But a more positive point is that 70% of the world's GDP is produced in urban areas, and so that's a very positive opportunity for us to work with more markets. NRC has 17 countries where it does urban work out of its 25. We work with everyone affected by displacement, including the host community, and where possible we take multi-sectoral area-based approaches, working routinely with and private sector partnerships, and pretty much taking a markets-based approach wherever we work. So now I'm going to hand over to Emmeline, who's going to share 2 examples where we've done markets assessments with both refugee and IDP communities.
Thanks, Laura. So yeah, I'm going to present quite briefly on the findings and challenges that we faced during these two examples of market analysis. So the first one is Jordan. So we conducted the market analysis in Jordan in April 2015, so earlier this year. So going to the context of it, we focused on the urban area in the northwest of Jordan. So you have to know that, I mean, at that time, there was little knowledge of urban displacement, and the humanitarian focus was mainly on camps. So we basically used a PCMMA approach, I mean, pre-crisis approach, looking at the impact of a large population increase of Syrian refugees into the greater urban areas. So what would happen in case a new influx of refugees crossed the border from Syria to Jordan? So regarding the education system, we actually looked at the whole market system, recognizing that it was quite extensive and rather complex. But the team felt that it was not yet ready to limit the system to narrower market systems, as they needed to understand the dynamics within the entire system. So the humanitarian response, specifically on education to date, has mainly focused on supporting and expanding the capacity of the Ministry of Education to absorb the influx of refugee children, so mostly on physical capacity. But looking at the entire system led us to identify gaps in supply and demand related to access to education for Syrian children, not only on physical aspects, but also on other aspects of the chain, the market system itself. And so then we assessed the capacity of the market system to address these gaps. So what we identified were both supply and demand gaps. So in terms of we identified systemic issues. As some of you may know, there's currently a double shift system in place for education in Jordan. So basically the morning, so the Jordanian kids go to school in the morning and the Syrian children go to school in the afternoon. And there's somehow we identified the lack of tailored services for children, especially children for Syrian children, especially children at risk of dropout. And one of the big issues also is that Syrians can't access vocational education or higher education in this context. So there's also a gap in terms of systems and planning capacity. Physical space is a big issue also. So as I previously mentioned, some work is done around that, but we identified inadequate school infrastructures in terms of size and number of classrooms, wash facilities, etc. Human resources and technical capacity. So linking with that double shift system, the teachers who teach in the afternoon are often students or, you know, at least teachers who are not prepared to deal with and to teach such, you know, special needs children, or they're not specialized in psychosocial and emergency educational programs. In terms of perception and attitude, so I mentioned already the lack of tailored services for Syrian teenagers at risk of dropout. There is a high risk of dropout linked to early marriage for, you know, teenage girls and informal work for boys. And yeah, there's a lack of access to vocational and higher education, but there's also for Syrians, but there's also negative perceptions of Syrian parents with a perceived discrimination between Jordanians and Syrians. And the Syrian parents are often not aware of which schools are registering students or not, based on the capacity of the Syrian children to produce, to show documentation, you know, the refugee registration cards. Financial capacity, finally, is a supply and demand gap also. Supply because there's a lack of funding for teachers and also a lack of funding of adequate infrastructure. I mentioned the physical space. In terms of the demand, there's a lack of capacity for the Syrian parents to pay for education costs, so transportation, clothes, food, stationery, etc. So the response analysis was based on this gap in market analysis, and the responses gave a wide range of, you know, options to try and address and support these gaps, to support the markets in addressing these gaps. So in terms of the challenges, so maybe, yeah, we can show you an example of the map in the next slide. Yeah, so I'm not going to go into much detail around that because we are going to share, as soon as it's ready, we're going to share this report with you. But that's what the map looked like. So as I said before, it's quite complex and it's very, it's quite heavy. So that was basically due to the need of the team, the program team, to have a good overview of the situation and where the main bottlenecks are. So I'm not going to spend that much time on this map. But in terms of the challenges, so complexity of the market system, I've said a lot about that. So on top of that, there is a need to understand other key market systems that are linked to these to this one. So, for example, credits, transport, housing, and informal employment of children is a big issue. Also, it's informal employment of children is a key factor influencing dropout for Syrian boys. Just as a reminder, refugees in Jordan don't have the right to work outside camps. So there is a very low profile, and actually we found that a lot of Syrian kids are doing some kind of, you know, black market work, and during school days. So we probably need to dig deeper into that. And there's a strong link between, you know, education dropout and the capacity of the children to work and support their parents in the households. But on top of that, market mapping provided a very useful overview of the sector and brought a new systemic approach to technical program managers, especially in the social technical programs. So mapping the education system highlighted where there is a gap and where relationship between education systems, social cohesion, and coping mechanisms are better addressed together. besides education, we also analyzed another very innovative, I would say, market system. It was social engagement opportunities for youth. So we used the MA/PCMMA approach to analyze this, and the same dynamic arose in relation to linkages between mapping the system and understanding social cohesion and coping mechanisms all together. So it was very interesting. Moving on to Goma. So in Goma, we conducted the study in November 2014, so a bit more than a year ago. At that time, humanitarian interventions focused mainly on camps, and there was little knowledge, again, on urban displacement. So saturation of camps and sites around Goma meant that there were not many places for newly displaced IDPs to receive assistance. So this EMA, so it was an EMA this time, looking at how the most recent wave of displacement had affected the situation and the markets in the urban area of Goma. So here we focused on the impact on the market systems for credit, rental, and water. In terms of their access for people affected by displacement in the urban area of Goma. So, of course, this included IDPs, but also host communities. So in credit, so credit is used by target groups to launch and try to sustain some small income generating activities, or simply to meet their household needs. So in terms of the findings on the market system itself, we found that the primary credit source for IDPs were host households themselves. Displaced households would get in-kind credits, like housing and food, against daily non-paid work like water collection, cleaning, etc., but also some cash loans. But actually, households are not, the host households are only marginally better off than IDPs due to the impact of hosting, and yet they act as safety nets for newly arrived IDPs to whom they often loan money with no guarantee of its return. So there's obviously a cascade of impacts, and as any kind of shock affecting the host community's access to credit would of course impact the access for IDPs. There are mainly two potential sources of credit on the informal credit market system, so the small traders and the solidarity groups, les groupes solidaires in French. The conditions here are mostly to being well known by the community and running a profitable IGA, income generating activity. Since 2012 and this massive displacement wave, a new mechanism has appeared, the small informal saving groups, where the conditions were a bit more flexible so that vulnerable households and IDPs could actually access, but the amount of weekly contribution yet was very high for vulnerable families, and the amount of credit that you could obtain was very limited. So we remain with a very high demand for credit among the target groups, but the supply in the market couldn't meet this demand for various factors, such as the fact that IDPs cannot meet the required guarantees, they lack regular and predictable income, and there is a negative perception of their stability. So here, a key underlying factor here again is the lack of documentation for displaced people. So you can see here the emergency affected map. So sorry, it's in French, but I'm sure most of you can actually understand very quickly. And I'm not going to go through much detail. We're going to share the report afterwards again. But you can see clearly here the effects in red, the impact of the emergency on the market system and new actors coming in. So you'll see that in more detail. Going to the rental market system now. So what we found, so we analyzed rental in two neighborhoods, one overcrowded neighborhood close to the city center of Goma, and another one further away with less access to markets and services. So what we found is that there is no discrimination in accessing rental between hosts and IDPs. Cash is the main factor. candidates for rental must have the capacity to pay upfront, sometimes up to 6 or 9, 12-month rent, which is a huge amount of money compared to this target group's income. So there is a very strong link here with accessing credits, as indebtedness is the main mechanism for these households to access rental. The rental prices went up significantly, and which vulnerable displaced had less access to it, which meant that it created more dependency on the host communities, who then become more impoverished. So you see, I was talking about the cascade of impacts earlier on. It's also something that you see here. So another impact also on the displacement wave on the rental market system was other displacements, the vulnerable caretakers this time. So caretakers were traditionally those people living in the house for free in exchange of taking care of the property for the landowner. So some of these vulnerable caretakers were moved by landowners to accommodate displaced relatives. So another layer of vulnerability here. So when analyzing the market system maps, we found that the market environment, the top layer of the maps, was heavily impacted and modified by the crisis. Impacts were on relations and cohesion within the community, but also power dynamics. And so the crisis had brought a new dimension to the role of the local traditional chiefs, with conflict resolution between owners and tenants, linked with an increased rate of eviction risks. So in terms of the challenges faced in this exercise, so first, just very briefly, the map of the rental market system. So as I mentioned, you see a lot of red here in the top layer. That's the market environment. So a lot of change in the dynamics. And that's very important to highlight, because if we go to the challenges, you see here the second point is the importance of understanding local power analysis. So that's a very critical issue. And somehow we faced a lack of this knowledge within the team that conducted the assessment. So we of course, we interviewed a lot of local chiefs and political leaders, or people having power, but we faced somehow a gap between the knowledge of our team and the dynamics in place, because a lot of things are not said in interviews, during the interviews. So that's very critical to have the adequate knowledge within the team. Also, unknown IDP numbers outside camps, it did impact on our capacity to quantify the gaps. And finally, so these markets were very dynamic, especially with the impact of successive waves of displacement, and there is a need to continuously monitor and update the market maps and the analysis. So I leave it now to Laura to summarize the key lessons learned from these two examples.
Okay, so the two examples that we've shared have been non-commodity markets. So this was a bit exploratory for us, and we wanted to understand, would this be an effective way of understanding systems and market systems in particular, but also beyond market systems, interrelationships in those contexts, to help us better understand and then plan for multi-sectoral approaches and integrated programming. And we found that they were effective ways of looking at those contexts, but that it was really important to understand the interrelationships between different markets, because we felt that that relationship was somewhat magnified in urban contexts. And when we've looked at markets alongside each other, it's given us a much better understanding. So, for example, when we looked at credit and rental markets together, because of that interrelationship, it was a much deeper understanding and a much better we felt better informed and were able to design a more interesting and integrated approach to that. We did find that with some of the bigger systems, so for example, the education system in Jordan, there was no secondary data to look at to do the preliminary planning. We needed really to have a better preliminary mapping in order to help us focus our analysis. Otherwise, the system can be very wide. So that's, I guess, just a kind of a step that we would need to add in and make it a bit more significant in order to repeat this process. But also we felt that we needed a better context analysis for some of the bigger picture work, you know, a more socioeconomic political power analysis that ensured that the mapping was not only appropriate but the responses were appropriate too. And that's something that isn't a step along the way. It in the EMA and the PCMMA, it relies on external context analysis, and these don't always exist for urban contexts. So it is something that we're very aware of, and we are working towards as well.
Thanks ever so much, Laura and Emmeline, and to Alexandra as well for 3 really interesting presentations with definitely a lot of food for thought for all of us. We've had some questions come in already, and we already have our questions that were submitted in advance of the presentation. So we're going to jump right into the Q&A and actually go back to kind of the fundamental question of this webinar, which is one of the questions that we've had submitted. Just to clarify, because there's so much detail in the presentations, I think it would be useful to start off with just thinking quite basically, what are the key differences between urban and rural market analysis? What are the differences? So considering, Alexandra, you presented the kind of evolution of market analysis approaches, I'm going to turn this one over to you to begin with, to just see if you could give us some thoughts about what the key differences are between urban and rural market analysis.
Thanks for this, for letting me opening the floor with the Q&A. So I try to stress the importance of urban spaces as networks, and these multiple and overlapping networks in which urban residents interact. So urban markets play a critical role. The role of markets in urban areas is even more important than rural areas. So a lot of people in urban areas rely on markets for their food sources first. So that's a critical point, because urban spaces act as nodes. They're connected with the rural areas, with national market, but also international markets. So in terms of urban markets are more exposed to disruption, price increases, for example. So that's one of the key elements, and I think that's something that was mentioned in the presentation by NRC. The need to monitor indicators and to update the finding. I think this is a critical one. Things change faster in urban environments. Will the number of different actors, so the more actors involved in the systems, the livelihood options are more diverse. So this is some of the differences between urban markets and rural markets. And the key, a very tricky point in carrying out market analysis in urban areas is targeting. So how do you sample? How do you use your households, your areas? So this is tricky because also because of the fluidity. People don't spend the whole day in their house. So to capture some of these dynamics is tricky. Food security, for example, a lot of meals are eaten outside. people have different jobs. They might be working during the day. They might have one type of job during the day and another one during and people, a lot of people move around. So it's difficult to capture this. So when you carry out your market assessment, you might have some findings, but you might come up with some indicators that might help you to identify changing trends. But the monitoring of these indicators might have to be more frequent, more repetitive than in rural areas, I would say. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alexandra. I'm going to turn to Emmeline to see if you have anything to add on that one, and as well to pose our next question, which relates to examples of market analysis in terms of remote managed contexts as well as cross-sectoral kind of approaches. So I wonder if you can first add any thoughts you have to this question about the key differences between urban and rural, and then also address a question that we've had submitted looking for examples of market analysis in remotely managed contexts, as well as using market analysis to understand cross-sectoral analysis. So I'll turn to Emmeline now.
Thanks very much, Leah. Now, in terms of this first question on the key differences between urban and rural market analysis, I think Alexandra has covered the main answers. As you know, urban markets are really somehow essential in many countries, and they will link rural markets and international markets. So I think I'm not going to add a lot about that, but yeah, the dynamics are, I mean, a bit more different and a bit, yeah, more vibrant maybe. And as was mentioned during our presentation, also as Laura said, you know, we sense there's that feeling that the interrelationship, the interconnection between markets are magnified in urban environments. So there's a strong link between, you know, credit markets and rental, or, you know, any kind of livelihood, income generating markets, etc. Examples of remote managed market assessment and analysis. So we've been very recently conducting such kind of analysis. So it was a consortium composed of CARE, NRC, and FAO in southern Syria, where from Jordan we conducted this ANEMA in southwestern Syria, and the key lesson learned there was that, I mean, a key positive point was that we conducted a livelihood analysis prior to conducting this EMA, and it was really of added value, because when we designed the livelihood assessment, we had in mind that we were going to conduct this market analysis. So the livelihood results, the livelihood analysis results did inform us a lot on you know, how to select the markets and which critical market systems we were going to look at. So in this context, we specifically looked at livelihood input markets, so in terms of agricultural inputs and also livestock inputs. But we found that there was a lot of similarities and a lot of linkages between various markets in this context. And if we had looked at the transport, or if we had looked at other, you know, small businesses and other income generating activities or market systems, we would have found some very similar you know, constraints and in terms of the capacity of the market system to cover needs. And that highlighted this issue of, you know, having cross-sectorial market assessments and analysis. And we started touching the you know, the fact that some markets are representative, and what you can see on one market system may be what you will find on another market system. The context there was not only urban, but it was also rural in quite densely populated areas. So it was it was really interesting, but the key lesson learned here was that the livelihood analysis that we conducted right prior to this market analysis did inform a lot and helped us in identifying the best, the most critical and representative market systems. And also we got a lot of information on the, we were talking about the power analysis. So that's also something that we learned and we gained knowledge on during the livelihoods assessment that we conducted prior to that.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to move now to the next question, and this is one that's been submitted, and I think that Alexandra, you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, so perhaps I'll turn with this one to Laura. And the question is about what the overlap areas are in terms of humanitarian and development work, and as well as the potential areas for collaboration when it comes to understanding urban markets, urban market analysis. So I'll turn now to Laura to get some thoughts on that question.
Emma was developed out of a development tool, a development markets approach. It was adapted for more rapid humanitarian contexts. And there's continuing work around, the GEM tool, the PCMMA, and so the work goes on. And it's really important that overlap with our development colleagues and the insights that they get from much deeper, much longer market analysis is really vital. And we should really utilise that in the countries that we work in to get that deeper and greater understanding. It's a little bit more tricky in the context where NRC works. We work mostly with conflict-affected countries where there might not be so many development actors. But as much as possible, we try to engage with other actors to be part of any process, any analysis, and ensure that there's consensus around the findings, that they can be applied not only to the work of our NGO, but also, where possible, to influence perhaps the thinking around the different types of market interventions. The model that Alexander presented, where there were the sort of three depths or three levels of market intervention, with cash being the very lightest. And I think it's really vital if we're going to be working on ensuring more resilient approaches in urban contexts, to have that thinking which is one step ahead. How can we work with market systems to strengthen those approaches? And how can we work with local authorities and engage with them so that they're not separate processes carried out by NGOs, that there is something that's a capacity that's built, but also a common understanding and approach that's taken that can strengthen the existing thinking rather than creating some sort of parallel thinking or parallel system. And that way I think it will really help us to future-proof some of the urban responses which are being still sometimes, they're still quite pilot approaches. They're not always very established approaches in urban areas, even though we've been working in urban contexts for more than 10 years. It still struggles to compete sometimes with rural approaches which are very much more established.
Great, thanks, Laura. I think we'll turn now to a subject which we've got quite a few questions have come in about it, and it's something that for ALNAP we're quite interested in this as well, given we're about to start a research project that relates to some of these areas, and that's to do with this idea of markets and market analysis as a way to understand urban systems. And so I think both presentations touched on this a little bit in terms of Alexandra, you talked about the importance of understanding the different aspects of the urban system, and Emmeline, you also talked about using market analysis to understand things like social cohesion and engagement opportunities, as well as the understanding between labor and transportation systems and things like this. And so there's a few questions within this topic. I guess the first is to what degree is market analysis a useful way of looking at urban systems? One of the specific questions we've had submitted is it the right tool to be using to understand something like an education system? Are there limitations on using a market tool for looking at urban systems, and are there other tools that might be more useful, or is this a really useful way of understanding urban systems? So I think this is such a broad topic. I'll turn to all of you, but maybe perhaps we'll start with Emmeline and just see your thoughts, and then we'll go to our other panelists as well on this one.
Thanks, Leah. I think to me, market analysis can be one of the basics to understand urban systems. So as you mentioned, by mapping these market systems, we started identifying, linkages and correlations, interrelations between different market systems, be they, input systems, commodity systems, or non-commodity services, etc. So when we started doing this market analysis for the education system in Jordan, so of course we were wondering if EMA or PCMMA was the right tool. So you have to know that we conducted this analysis with the education program managers, so people with a strong education program management profile and very good knowledge of educational programming. And the thing, what they found is that looking at the education system with this angle of a market system and with this somehow socio-economic angle, especially on the economic aspect, they really found it very interesting in the way that it made them think about supply and demand gaps, and what EMA and PCMMA brought, what really the added value of it was, to map this market system maps were very useful way of showing the entire system in its complexity, of course, but yeah, that's what I can say. Probably Laura can give a bit more detail on how market analysis can be better used to understand urban systems.
Great. We'll move to Laura next and hear her thoughts as well.
Thank you. What the feedback that we've had has been that that currently people have the option of using a stakeholder analysis or a more kind of socio-political context analysis. They're the things which people are using to look at systems. I guess that the feedback has been that using a markets-based approach has not only laid out how the systems interrelate, but it also looks at possible response options. So it's very useful for program design. It needs to be updated, but it can be quite fluid. It doesn't have to be something that's static. We found that when you're looking at a very broad, complex system like education across Jordan, because although we looked at a bid, it was based, what the policy and the conditions in a bid are representative of the national position on education. So it goes broader than the city or the urban place that we're analysing. And we felt that there were some gaps with what the PCMMA could give us, that we needed a better understanding of some of the sort of the power analysis between the political positions and policies and parties. But that it did provide a lot of very useful information which has been used to adapt the approaches that we've taken to create a more integrated approach, and also for advocacy around some of the areas where we don't do direct programming, but where we're working through the local authorities or even the national government. So our feeling is that it's not a perfect tool, but it has been very useful and a quite different and effective way of looking at non-commodity markets.
That's great. Thanks, Laura. And I'll turn as well to Alexandra to hear his thoughts about this question as well.
So I'll just focus on one of the elements that Laura mentioned around advocacy. So this is one big sector of work for Oxfam, and I think this is one of the reasons we've been promoting the PCMMA. It's a question of better understanding the situation, the interplay between the different actors in the system. So I think Emily mentioned the 3 layers of the market system. So the actors or elements in the environment, in the middle layer, so the actual traders, consumer, but also in terms of the services and how they interact together. And because of the numbers of people, whether it's in poor urban areas or slums, this is going to be very tricky to target them with direct intervention. So a lot has to be done with indirect intervention. I think advocacy is one of the ways, raising awareness on some issues, working with local partners, civil society organization, community leaders, neighborhoods, so that they better understand some of the reasons of their vulnerability. This is something that is quite that can be achieved with some of these tools, like the PCMMA. And it doesn't mean that your organization will be the one implementing all the project, but if you've managed to establish a good working relationship with the local authorities, and actually the PCMMA is a way to work to coordinate market assessment with the ensuring that they are involved in the process, so that there will be hopefully some buy-in from the local authorities. This is a very interesting starting point, and just I'd like to share an example with you on some of the work that Oxfam has been doing with our partners in South Africa, in Durban, for example. We work with an organization called PAXA, and they are monitoring price indicators, and they managed to reject a proposition put forward by the national electricity provider that wanted to raise the prices. And based on their analysis based on the monitoring and the analysis of the prices, and they were able to show how an increase in electricity bills will impact on people's food security. So this is a good example of, we work with the partner, Oxfam works with the partner, they analyze markets, they understand how critical markets are for ensuring people's food security, and how an increase in electricity bills would affect their food security. I think this is quite a good example in terms of advocacy. So they make quite some noise about this, about the detrimental impact of such an increase in the electricity bills. And that was this very strong advocacy and lobbying message. And at the end, this initiative, the increase in electricity for the electricity bill didn't happen. So yeah, understanding some of these things could inform programming or the work of our partners. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, all three of you, for your thoughts on that question. I think it's a big one, and as important as so many recommendations are suggesting that it's so important for humanitarians to understand urban areas. I think the work that's happened with market analysis is a really useful way to start to understand some of these things. So it's great to have your thoughts. We've had a few questions come in about resilience. Someone has helpfully provided even a definition for us, as resilience is the capacity to survive, adapt, transform, and prepare for the next stress or shock. And so I thought maybe we'd turn now to looking at whether markets are part of the answer on how to strengthen urban resilience, and as well on that theme, how in your range of experience with urban market analysis, how you've seen the resilience of markets. So if we'll start with Laura and then hear her thoughts, and then we can go from there.
I was just about to say Oxfam, I think, is much further ahead than some of the other organisations in relation to their work on resilience. So maybe Alexandra would be a good place to start. And certainly for NRC, it's something that we struggle with when we are dealing with protracted crises and constantly evolving conflicts to really install something that is a solid resilience program. We do have some interventions in urban areas in the Horn of Africa, and they're big programs and they're very much in the pilot stage. So I'm hoping that we will be able to come back with something solid to ALNAP, but we're certainly not there yet.
So this is a very broad topic, but something I can mention. This is the message I've been trying to share with the audience today, is that there's much more. There's a lot of things that can be done with market analysis, and understanding what can be done with some of these tools, whether it's EMA or PCMA, is quite useful in changing a bit the way humanitarian programs are implemented. So by focusing on some of the structural dysfunctions of market, trying to understand these things, right? Every time during the rainy season, the risk of cholera is high. During the rainy season, these roads get flooded. These are some of the elements that might be identified thanks to a good market mapping analysis exercise. So such an exercise will help to focus on actually some of the structural problem of people's vulnerability. In many situations, particularly in urban areas, a key problem is not availability of services or commodities or goods, whether it's food, soap, chlorine, all these things. It's a problem of people's very limited purchasing power. So by understanding this, and how in times of emergency, how these limited financial resources are allocated, this helps to understand people's critical needs and what can actually be done at another level. So maybe not directly, it could be directly in the value chain. So working with other, not directly with the beneficiaries of the population, but with other actors in the market chain, but more importantly with the other elements outside the direct market chains. So these elements on the top, on the environment, and this is where you can, this is where you can actually target policies. In many cases, a way to actually reduce people's vulnerability is to change some elements in the environment. So it could be a policy that better protect the urban poor. It could be social protection mechanisms. All these elements. So shedding light on these structural causes, raising awareness from the vulnerable groups, so that they understand this and they see the correlation between a shock and their increasing food insecurity, for example. So this I would say this is a way that resilience can be strengthened, encouraging agencies not only to focus on the immediate causes. Okay, people are food insecure, let's do cash transfer to increase their purchasing power. This is just a very tiny part of the problem, but understanding actually why livelihood options are so limited. This is a starting and entry point to better understand people's structural or chronic vulnerability. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. We're getting towards the end of the presentations today, so I'm going to try and fit in two quick questions to round us off. I wanted to turn again to Emmeline because we've had a question come in about the potential role for microfinance institutions in strengthening local urban markets immediately after a disaster. And I know that you might have some thoughts to add on this based on your experience with the market work around credit markets in Goma.
Yes, thanks, Leah. So indeed, of course, the answer here is yes, there is a big role for microfinance institutions. Immediately after a disaster, yes, but also in preparation of the disaster. So just to come back to the credit market system in Goma, when we conducted this market system analysis, we identified who the MFIs were, and in terms of the formal ones, but also the informal ones. And it's something that helped NRC to understand what role they were playing and what were their capacity in absorbing new beneficiaries or involving the target groups. So it was really good to understand where they were, who they were, what they were working on. And the first recommendation of this market analysis of the credit market system was to work with the existing systems in place, including these MFIs, because they were already there. They had the knowledge, and they may just lack some capacity, and they may need some support in trying to address a wider range of beneficiaries and needs. But that was in response to a disaster. But using a PCMMA approach, a pre-crisis approach, market analysis, helps you to also identify these MFIs and know where they are, what they do, and potentially, when you identify gaps in their capacity to address the needs, then one of the indirect response options that you can have could be to support these existing institutions. Because your role, our role as humanitarian actors is not to replace or is not to, of course, duplicate efforts. And one of the treasures of doing this market system analysis is to know what the capacities are, what is existing, and strengthen them where needed to prepare for a disaster or to respond to a disaster. So yes, a strong yes to this question.
Great, thanks, Emmeline. And in our last minute or so, I'm just going to turn for our final question to Laura. I think it's quite obvious that in crisis, there's a huge need for information as soon as possible. And one of the questions that came in the registration process is about this need to balance the need for detailed information with time constraints, so the kind of speed versus depth of information. So I guess the question boils down to, how do you get market analysis done well but quickly? And so for that, we'll turn to Laura for the last word on this one before I wrap up the webinar.
I think sometimes market analysis has got a bad name for itself in that, it can take typically a week to 10 days to collect the data and then longer to write the report. But the framework does not have to be used as part of a training process with a big group of people. It can be the guiding principles, the questions that are answered as you go through the process of all the different markets analysis tools, can be applied by individuals who want to quickly and rapidly collect some data. It doesn't always have to be about the whole system, it can be about a single part of the system, really depending on what your defining questions are. So it's very adaptable, and equally it can go into much more detail than typically MMs do or PCMMs do. So I think I think the message I want to give is that it does not have to be a lengthy process, but it is really vital to understand how markets function even at the most basic level, even just to make sure that we do no harm in the first stages of a response, and that we look at more sort of exploratory and innovative ways to intervene in the market rather than just at the beneficiary household level, because there are other mechanisms and support structures or policies or influencing that can be done which are just as effective, if not more effective. So I would say that it can be as quick and dirty as you want. It does not have to be perfect. It might be good enough. It might apply the optimal ignorance sort of perspective, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be useful to do. And I would argue that it should always be done with all program interventions, but particularly in urban areas because of the complexity of urban markets and because of the need for urban dwellers to engage in those markets. They produce a lot less for themselves. You know, and there are a whole load of other tools as well. There's the RAM, the MAG. You know, it doesn't need to be one specific market approach.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks to all of the presenters. Unfortunately, we've reached the limits of the webinar timing, but it's always a good place to leave a webinar, I think, when there's still more to say and still more questions to ask, because the great benefit that we have in terms of doing these webinars is that we have our community of practice, and so we'll be putting in the various questions that were submitted that we didn't have time for, and also encouraging all of you to submit your own experiences. I know the huge wealth of knowledge there is in the community of practice and amongst the attendees here at today's webinar. So as I say, thank you to our speakers, to you, the audience, as well as to my colleagues at ALNAP who helped to put this webinar together. We have, as I think I've mentioned in the COP, our next webinar will be about social cohesion, and that will be sometime in February. So we're looking forward to that and hope to see all of you there again. So thank you once again to Alex, to Emmeline, to Laura for taking the time to prepare and present with us today. It's been really interesting, and we've covered such a huge range of concepts to do with urban markets today, and it's all thanks to your vast amounts of expertise that you were willing to share with us today. So thank you again. Thank you to all of you who stuck it out with us till the end, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Have a great rest of your day.